Okay, everyone, I think we're getting settled. I am going to use the mic because not all of us can hear the same. In this way, we make sure that everyone has access. And so if you have a question, I'm also going to give you the mic. Right, so let's commit to using it. I have had a lot of folks asking questions about what's happening with the church. And so I thought rather than having like 50 one-on-one conversations, it might be good to do an update. And so we want to take some time to do that, just talk about what's going on and do a little bit of Methodist 101 in the process. So I'll do a little bit of that. And then I'm going to just open it up for questions to hear what your questions are, what you're concerned about. I may not have the answers, but I will be writing down those questions, so if we have things I need to look up, I can. So that's kind of where we are. Now, the last time we had one of these little gatherings, we sang, and so I thought we'd start by singing a verse. They'll know we are Christians in parallel. So how about we do that? Let's sing. It's a good way to start. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. And we pray that all unity may one day be restored. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Yeah, it is appropriate. It's a good one. Good. Now, on my next slide, so we've got, I hadn't realized this till just now. Our next slide, what are we fighting for in the United Methodist Church? Because the reality is that there's a lot of fighting happening right now. There's a lot of jockeying for position and for things, and I think that there's three primary places over which the larger church is having some disagreements and some struggles. The first is over Scripture, thinking specifically about the authority of Scripture, how do we read Scripture, what do we think Scripture means. The second area is covenant. What do we understand to be what binds us together? And then the third component of that is structure and money. And I hate to say that's part of the conversation, but really there's a lot of disagreement about our structure, how big it should be, and then, of course, the funding that goes into all of that. So I'm going to kind of highlight these in a big picture way. I hope it'll be just an overview to give us some context. I'm going to start with structure, just because some of the others don't make sense in the same way unless you think about how the differences in structure. So there's kind of four components of structure to think about. We've got our annual conference, so we in Iowa are part of the Iowa annual conference. So we match our geographic area. We're also part of a jurisdiction. We're part of a north central jurisdiction, and I've got a map, so it's Dakotas, Minnesota, all the way over to Ohio. But we're on the southern tier, so Indiana and Ohio. The general conference is the big umbrella over all of these. And then we've got boards and agencies, which are, if you think about like the trustees committee and the missions committee, we have those for the whole denomination. So that's what our boards and agencies are. Does general conference include Africa? Yes. Yeah, so general conference is over the whole shebang. Something that's helpful. So we have jurisdictions in the U.S., but outside the U.S., they have something called central conferences. And I'll kind of highlight that quick, or in just a second. So something that's kind of interesting is if you think about the U.S. government, we've got three branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. The United Methodist Church, well, the Methodist Church was born at the same time as the U.S., and we also have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And so on this chart, when you think about the general church level, our legislature is the general conference. It's the group of delegates who get together to vote every 4 years, and I'm one of those delegates. The executive branch, instead of a president, all of the bishops together are the council of bishops. There is a president and a vice president, and they have their own structure. They have voice, but not vote. And then we have a judicial council, and they focus on what's in our Constitution, and which is just the first part, and then does all the other stuff relate to each other. So that's kind of what they do. General Conference writes that book, the Council of Bishops enforces it, and the Judicial Council, if there's problems, says what the answer should be. So then we've got the jurisdictions or central conferences, are kind of the next tier down. So we're part of North Central, like I said. All of the bishops of our area kind of function in that executive role for our region. And they tend to focus, there's an appeals court in the jurisdiction. They focus on holding bishops accountable. So that's kind of the focus of that. Then we've got our annual conference. So we get together in June every year and we vote on things related to the annual conference. Our resident bishop would be the executive branch. And then we don't have a council in the same way as you do in the others. We've got a committee on investigation. And if there needs to be a trial, then there would be a jury of peers that would be appointed. We've got districts, our district superintendents. We really don't have any judicial functions in this part. And then you've got your local church, and the closest thing to an executive would be your pastor, and that'd be me. But again, this is kind of that sense of, like, this is really kind of a voice but no vote, but enforce the rules kind of a picture. Is that helpful to kind of see those things? Who makes the rules? This group makes the rules. So like at our church conference, if we wanted to vote on something, it would have to be approved at our church conference to make those decisions. Okay. Trying to use my mouse over here. All right, so this is just another picture of that. So the local church sends people to annual conference sends people to general conference. Annual conferences also send people to jurisdictional. Jurisdictional conferences elect bishops. So there's kind of a little pattern here. The next picture shows the regions. So this is the jurisdictions in the US. So this is where we are. And there's different parts, and there's regional differences in theology and perspective, like there are in general in society. And then the next one I've got is central conferences. So this shows those 5 US jurisdictions. And then we also have all of these central conferences. And so you've got Philippines, you've got Eurasia, you've got 5 in Africa, and you've got the European Central Conferences. So something that's interesting, and this is part of the structure question and the money question. Currently, 97% of the general church budget, so the big picture, 97% is supported by the US. And part of that's because historically, we have seen the central conferences as mission fields. And so you don't expect the mission fields to give back. We send stuff to them. Well, we're trying to make a switch so that we have mutual ministry, so that we're all supporting the pie. But that has not really changed that much yet. So currently 97% of the budget is supported by the US. Question, yes? Yes, why are we sending mission dollars to Europe? So that's a great question. Largely, our presence in Europe has been in the last 50 years because the Methodist Church was born in the United States. So Wesley was in England. England is actually not part of the United Methodist Church. Wesley was part of the Church of England, and he said, you guys aren't living up to the standards of what church should be. So he started a small movement called Methodists and sent missionaries to the US. And so they started getting things happening. And then the US Revolution happened. And all of the Church of England folks were kicked out of the United States. All the priests went home. And there were all these Methodist societies. And So Wesley said, I'm going to send Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. So when you think of Cokesbury, Coke and Asbury, I'm going to send Coke and Asbury. So at the Christmas conference in 1795, I think that date's right. Don't quote me on it. Christmas conference, though. Christmas conference, the Methodist Church was born. So it was born in the United States. And so this movement is because we have sent people later, not because it's responding. There's such a Catholic and Protestant and Lutheran presence that we're having trouble making inroads. And in general, religion is declining a lot in Europe in general. That's a great question. So, yes.
Okay, so the general.
Yeah, let me.
Testing. So the general conference is the world.
Yes.
Okay. And how are the votes tabulated? Is it by population? Or is there an electoral college? Which is what they need.
So delegates to general conference are based on population of the areas. So based on the population of Iowa, not of the United Methodist population of Iowa, they have a certain amount and then they apportion them. So it's more like the House of Representatives and Senate as far as the allocation of delegates. The only change would be you get at least 2. So maybe it's a hybrid of the Senate. So even if your population is low, you do get at least 2. And so one interesting thing is there are 4 central conferences. No, there's a whole bunch of annual conferences in the Philippines. And so each of those get 2, even though their population is really small. So that's how they get sent. When you think about the makeup of delegates to General Conference, it historically has been that the U.S. was the vast majority of delegates. This year, it's much closer to 60-40, U.S., non-U.S., and it's estimated that in 20 years, the U.S. will be minority delegates in the General Conference. And it's based on the population of the people in the churches. So the African churches especially are growing by leaps and bounds. So another piece of this is that the Book of Discipline is our rule book. The only pieces that the global church has to follow is this much of the Book of Discipline. So if you exist outside the U.S., you can adapt all the rest of the Book of Discipline. Now the reason for this is really important, because if we're a U.S.-dominated church for a long time, and we are then telling other parts of the world how they need to run their ministry, that's very colonialist. And so having the ability to adapt outside the U.S. means that they can be contextual and talk about the concerns that they have. The ordination process is different in Africa than it is in the U.S. And part of that's because when you've got dirt roads covering hundreds of thousands of miles, not that much, but hundreds of miles, hundreds and thousands, it's harder to have the infrastructure to get to district committee meetings, like all the steps you have to go through. They have a simplified process just because of infrastructure. So the problem will be when the U.S. becomes less than 50%, but you've got 55% of the church voting on what the U.S. has to do. There's some tricky things that are going to happen as far as what we do with that. So that's one of the big picture structure and money questions. Okay, so we're fighting about structure and money. We're also fighting about scripture. So there are typically 6 verses that are referred to that talk about homosexuality, LGBTQI people. And faithful Christians disagree about how to talk or think about these scriptures. And the reason we disagree is because we have different ways that we understand the authority of Scripture or what things we should use to interpret. So there's something that's generally agreed upon. In fact, we're going to teach it really soon in confirmation, called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And there's these 4 elements: Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. And some people think they're all weighted the same. And some people think, you actually can't see the circle. This is a big Scripture circle. That Scripture is the big thing, and then you look at these as smaller things. There's actually like 10 different versions of this. And so when you think about what is the weight you give to different things, how do you approach something and apply the Scripture and interpret it today? That's part of the question that we're fighting about. And so you can look at different things. One example I was actually looking at an article. You can think about these. This word right here, especially arsenokotai, no one really knows what Paul meant when he wrote it, because it's the only time it appears in Greek, like in all of Greek. And so this is men, and this has to do with beds. But what does that mean? No one really knows. So if you look at, I was actually just reading an article. The King James Version translate this to men who abuse themselves with other men, with men who abuse themselves. I have it in my notes. Let me look for it so I get it right. Those that defile themselves with mankind is how the King James Version reads it. In the German and the Swiss and the, I have this written down too, Swedish and Norwegian versions, it talks about pederasty, or men who sleep with boys. And that's the way it's been translated in German and Norwegian and Swedish until 1983. And they only changed it because in the US in 1963, we changed that word to homosexuality. And so there's a conversation about, we have interpreted it that way, but that's not actually historically or traditionally how that was interpreted. So this is part of that. Like, do you look at tradition? Do you look at what the Scripture is? Do you look at the original Greek, or do you look at the version of the Bible that you've grown up with? That's part of the question that's being talked about right now.
So how is that used? How is the word used?
How is it? So this is a whole list in both of these. It's a whole list of things that you do that are bad, like lying, stealing, cheating, adultery, drinking, gambling, and then these are in that whole list of things. So it's not like you can't even look to context necessarily to say, what does that mean? Because it's just a list of things that are bad. If that makes any sense. Okay, and the same translation for this was used up here in Leviticus as well. Okay. Let's get ahead. Okay, so the last of those, covenant. What does it mean to be accountable? So is this the be all, end all of what we follow, and what it says in here is everything? Is it Scripture? If this disagrees with Scripture, then which takes priority? One of the things that we've done is when we talk about covenant, typically you're held accountable by your peers. So if there's a problem in the church, this is Matthew 18. If there's a problem, you go to the person that you have a problem with, and you resolve it, and if that doesn't work, you bring someone with you, and then if that doesn't work, you take it to the church. So that's our process. So bishops hold bishops accountable, clergy hold clergy accountable, and so there's a process where you try to resolve it. That's the first primary step. If you can't resolve it, then there is an option for trials. But the people who oversee that are always your peers as far as trials go. So there were changes to this process that we enacted in this past year. Okay, so that's just some background. Any other questions? That's probably a lot of information, but I hope it'll be helpful. Okay, so this is something that we've been using to describe the dilemma of the church. That there's kind of 4 groups of people. These are folks who believe in the traditional understanding of marriage and think that Scripture does not support LGBTQ relationships. These are folks who think that not only is that what I think, but that's the only thing the church should think. So this non-compatible. I can't be in a church with people who disagree with me on that. This group would be, they have the same perspective, but I'm willing to be in a church with people who disagree with me. We can figure out a way to make that work. So progressive compatibilists would be folks who say, when I read Scripture, I see support for LGBTQ people, and I'm willing to be in a church with people who may not see it that way. And then you've got progressive only perspective. So not only do I see Scripture affirming LGBTQ people, but I can no longer be in a church with people who will not affirm LGBTQ people. So that's kind of the makeup of the church. And so a lot of the things that are coming right now are coming out of one of these groups as far as the conversation that's happening.
What does the CNN poll show?
What does the CNN poll? The makeup? So if you listen to Adam Hamilton, he's done a lot of research on this. I don't know how accurate it is. He thinks it's like 15%, 15%, 60%. It is kind of a bell curve. He thinks it's a bell curve. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea. I don't know. We took a survey here in the manual. This is what we said. We did have, that's why we had a big chunk, because we had people who said nothing. So this was kind of our makeup. So 10%, 20%, 20%, 45%. So this was just a survey on one Sunday. That's kind of a sense of where we've been. Okay. I want you guys to ask questions. Okay, so these are some things that changed in 2019. The first thing we did was we secured pensions for everybody. So when I said that we have to talk about money, it's because there's money involved. And so the first thing was, no matter what happens, we wanted to make sure we cared for the clergy who've been giving their life to the church. There's a new definition of what it means to be a self-avowed practicing homosexual. So before, there's like a footnote, and updated the footnote. And so if you declare publicly, like on a Facebook status, or if you tell your DS, or if you are in a legally recognized relationship, that's what that counts as.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
I asked my wife if I could bring this up.
Yeah, here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry.
It just gets me that a few pastors that are homosexual call themselves queers. I think queer is a lot worse than homosexual myself. Derogatory, yeah. If I say somebody's queer, that's worse than homosexual or gay or whatever. That's just me. But it just amazes me at how some of these clergy from Eastern Iowa come right out and say we're queer.
So the way I think about that is that originally Methodist was a derogatory term. And so the early group, they actually called themselves the Holy Club to start off with. And they had like a prescribed set of things they did every day. And so people thought they were dumb and way too rigid. And they said, well, there go those Methodists. And they meant it in not a nice way. And that group then claimed that and said, well, yeah, fine, that's who we're going to be. So I think that would be an analogy for what's happening, is that group has said, this is the term we want to claim for who we understand ourselves to be. I don't know if that's helpful, but it has been historically a derogatory term. And I would say as well within the LGBTQ community, not everyone uses the same terminology or understands those words the same way. So, no, that's a great question because I think, yeah, for some people that's, why would they use that word? So another change, bishops cannot consecrate, commission, or ordain people who are self-avowed practicing homosexuals, and the district committee and the board of ordained ministry also can't. So this is like now written in stone. It wasn't specified in the same way before. The new thing, and this is the only thing we have a minimum penalty for. So remember when I talked about you're judged by your peers. Your peers also, in every other instance, decide what the penalty will be. This is the only thing that we have a mandatory minimum penalty. And so if you're clergy, and if you're convicted at trial of conducting a same-sex wedding, there's a mandatory minimum penalty. The first offense is 1 year suspension, and the second offense is you lose your credentials. So that's new. Then that process where you resolve the conflict has changed. Bishops previously could receive a complaint and say, I don't think we should deal with this, and stick it in a drawer and never deal with it. Now they can only dismiss it if it has no basis in law or fact. And this applies to every just resolution, not just those related to sexuality. If there's going to be a resolution, you have to name all the harms and how you're going to solve them. And the person who brought the complaint initially has to be a part of the process and agree with the resolution. So previously, if Rod was mad because of something I did that harmed him, he would bring a complaint to the bishop. And then the bishop would go through a process with me. You'd be kind of a part of it, but you would not necessarily have to agree with what the resolution that came out of that was. Now you do. And so if you don't like it, if you don't like whatever that resolution was, then there's no resolution. So that's a part of that. If it goes to a trial before, the church couldn't appeal. So like if in the civil court system, if I'm accused of murder, I go to a jury trial, and if they say not guilty, the state can't appeal that. You can't do double jeopardy. So we had the same process, but now the church can appeal the results of the trial. And then there's a new process for local churches to leave the denomination. Yeah.
Trying to allow the just resolution.
Yeah.
How is that workable if the aggrieved person doesn't agree with the resolution? What that doesn't make sense to me that's their identity. Is there no resolution then?
Yeah, so if there's no resolution, then it goes to, you think about the judicial process, it goes to that committee on investigation, and they will say if there should be a trial or not. So what this basically does is make it more likely that there will be trials rather than resolutions that are reached, if that makes sense.
So that's more like mediation.
This is more like mediation. Yeah, just resolution is like a mediation process. Absolutely. That's a great example. Okay, so those are things that changed. Most of these take effect January 1st of 2020. This took effect right after General Conference. So there are some churches that have started the process to leave the denomination as a result of that. There has been lots of turmoil as a result. Annual conferences, this is U.S. annual conferences, got to vote. So this was in February. In May and June, they voted on who they're sending to the next General Conference. And voted in the most progressive General Conference and jurisdictional conference delegations that we've ever had. And so if you think about like a red-blue swing, like this is a large blue swing when you think about it that way. If you think about the makeup of the U.S., this part of the U.S. is very conservative. This is very conservative. The West is extraordinarily liberal. And then the North Central is kind of somewhere in between. There is not a majority conservative delegation anywhere in the United States. which is very strange. In fact, this is like 60%, this is 88%, 81%, 88%, 67, and 100%. And so that was just a like reaction in some ways of annual conferences in the US saying, we don't like what just happened. It's kind of what happened. How does that compare worldwide? I don't know what the makeup of the global delegations are, because they are just now starting their voting process. So that piece I'm not sure about. Traditionally, Western Europe has been more progressive and everywhere else has been more conservative. That's just kind of the balance of that. Some annual conferences have created task forces to leave the denomination. So New England, Oregon, Idaho, Desert Southwest, Michigan, like entire annual conferences have talked about leaving the United Methodist Church. They haven't done it yet, but they're exploring what it would mean if they did. Iowa has not done that. So there are a couple of groups. If you think about those 4 sugar packets, the Wesley Covenant Association would be the traditional non-compatibilist. These are folks who do not want to be in a denomination, folks who disagree with them. In the same way, Forward would be on the progressive side, and they say we can no longer stay in the denomination with people who disagree with us. And so you've got those kind of groups on the edges. UMC Next has tried to reach to the people in the 2 middle groups. And that is started with Adam Hamilton as part of that original group. I'm actually on the team that's leading the UMC Next group. And the question that we're asking is, it's likely people will leave. How do we hold the big chunk together? That's kind of the question that we've been focusing on. So there's all these negotiations happening between all these different groups saying, okay, something's going to change. How do we navigate that? The one thing that I have seen very clearly is that all the plans submitted for 2020 from the US have some sort of separation. So there's some kind of division. The global church is opposed to separation. So the Philippines bishops, the African bishops have said, we will not separate or divide the United Methodist Church. And right now, that's 40% of the votes. So that's kind of a dilemma that we're facing. Part of that is because where does their funding come from if the church divides up? So yes, they have 40% of the votes, but 3% of the revenue. Currently, that's the way it works right now. So that's kind of this, like, the US may say, we don't like this, but the rest of the church may say, too bad. I don't know, there's this kind of dilemma that we're facing right now. So these are some possibilities. Yes, go ahead.
So in that scenario, could a conference like Iowa still spin off, or is that overridden by Philly?
Could a conference like Iowa still spin off? So there's a question that's out there right now, and part of what we don't know is it constitutional? Right now, there's a process for a local church to leave. There is not a process for an annual conference to leave. And so that's the big question is, could an annual conference just leave the denomination? And one of the things, so there's 2 things that could happen. One, you could write a new rule to make that possible. The other thing is, you could try to do it, and then it would go to judicial council, and they would decide, yes, what you did was okay, or no, what you did was not okay, and it wasn't valid, and you're still part of us, too bad. So that's the dilemma at the moment. No one knows if you can do it or not. So there's some possibilities that this is kind of a summary of some plans that we already know about that are coming to 2020. The first is to make the United States a new thing called a regional conference. Now, there's what it would do is it would basically give the U.S. kind of the same authority as central conferences, that we could adapt parts of the discipline for our context. The reason, however, that we can't use central conference language in the U.S. is because we have a history of racism. So when the Methodist Church and the Methodist Church South split, it was over slavery. And when we came back together, the way we came back together is we said, okay, this is great, but we're going to put all the Black churches, not in annual conferences, but in one central conference. And so the central conference was the entire United States. It was all the Black churches. So it was a segregation of the Black church.
Is that like the AME?
Is that like the AME? No, this was still United Methodist. What was Methodist then? It was Methodist. The AME, this is actually a great example. The AME Zion would have, if you thought about those same 4 sugar packets, the AME would be like those people over here who said, if you're going to be, if you're not going to support the ministry and affirm the ministry of Black people, we can no longer stay in this church, so we're going to form our new church. So that's probably a good example of, they said, we can no longer stay in this denomination, so we're going to form something else. So the AME Zion Church, the CME Church, all split from the Methodists because we would not fully embrace African Americans. Okay, so that's why we can't use central conference. So this would create a regional conference. And the idea would be that the U.S. church would gather and decide all of this stuff, and then the general conference would gather and only talk about this stuff, rather than going on everything. So that's one of the solutions that was proposed. This is supported by the global church. This is also supported by moderates and progressives in the U.S. because it would allow some flexibility. It is not supported by conservatives in the U.S. because they are a minority of the U.S. Methodist Church. And so if you're in a church, if you're in a group that says, I can no longer be in a church that would allow for same-sex marriage, for example, and the U.S. Regional Conference allowed for that, the conservative, non-compatibilist church would say, I can't stay in that, I have to leave. So even though this seems like it's a solution, there's still going to be folks who won't stay. Okay, so the Indianapolis plan, the Indy plan, this was a group of folks from all 4 of those sugar packets got together. And the answer that they came up with is they're going to divide the United Methodist Church into 2 groups, at least 2 groups. The annual conferences will vote which of the groups they want to join. The default for the U.S. would be a centrist progressive church. The default for outside the United States would be the traditionalist church. So this would basically separate the majority of the U.S. from the global church. It would create a division. All of the boards and agencies would go with the U.S. church. What makes the global church really unhappy about that is that the boards and agencies are what support them in their work and ministry. But the traditionalist U.S. church doesn't want the boards and agencies. And so that's that proposal. The plan that I was a part of, the UMC Next Church, what we did is we said, let's not rewrite this. Let's keep that. It creates a path for those who want to leave on either side to leave. And what it actually does is create a task force to say all those other problems about membership and voting and money, we have to figure out what it means to be a global church. And so we have to rethink this whole structure to make it equitable across the board. So that's what this group is intending to do.
Question.
Yes.
When you say creates a path for vote, is this by church?
So the UMC Next is by church. for groups of 50 or more churches that want to band together. So there's like if their whole series of groups want to leave together, they could. The Forward Plan is called New Expressions of Wesleyan, of the Wesleyan Church. They actually propose to dissolve the whole shebang and to create 4 new denominations, which would basically be those 4 sugar packets. So there's a progressive, a moderate, a conservative, and a traditional church. So that's what this plan is to just throw the whole thing out.
With that
Start
last
over.
one then, we as a church here, Emmanuel, we take a vote, a secret ballot vote to decide which of the 4 we want to be in, and the majority wins.
That is how this one works, yes. Yeah. Now, so there's also, so in all of these plans, part of the conversation is how do you decide who leaves? And this group thinks it's like a 50% vote. We think it should be at least a 2/3 majority vote to leave. Because it's not healthy if you decide something by 51%. That's just not going to be healthy. So that's part of this like negotiation is can we come up with something that we all can agree with right now? There's not anything that everyone's agreeing. So. Yes.
I just wonder what the flavor is overall from those 4 plans, what you see Emmanuel and what you see the Iowa Conference, and what does your crystal ball say about some of this stuff? Not put you on the spot.
Yeah,
No, I mean, I think that's a good question. I don't know. I actually think one of the interesting things about Iowa right now is if you think about those 4 sugar packets, Iowa is probably, the bulk of the folks would be in that progressive compatibilist part. But we have a really strong group of folks who no longer want to stay in a church that has any form of discrimination. So even if I was to guess about Iowa, I would say that this would be pretty good for most of Iowa to stay together. But there are going to be really progressive folks and really conservative folks who leave, no matter what. Maybe like 10% on each side. But I think when you think about that bell curve, the default is we stick around together. And so you have to vote if you want to leave. Something like this, Iowa would vote to be in the centrist church. Just looking at our votes in Iowa, we would not vote in Iowa to be a part of the traditionalist church. If it was something like this with 4 new churches, I have no idea, to be completely honest. It would probably be like 10%, 25%, 25%. Well, none of that math works, but it would basically fracture the Iowa church, is what this would do. It would fracture our annual conference. So I think if you looked at Emmanuel, if you just looked at those numbers that we shared, one of the things I saw when we asked those questions was that the majority of folks, whether they agree or disagree with the decision, want to be a part of this church. And so I don't know which of these options would be best for me or where we end. I think based on what we've seen so far, Emmanuel is more progressive and more conservative. But we've also got people who are married to each other who are on different sides of that. And so that's part of the reality is we're family. And so I don't know how you make some of these decisions as a local church without having some really good, hard conversation. And so I think that might be part of as we think about what comes next as a church is how do we start having some good, hard conversations so that we don't splinter into 4 different pieces.
What do you think will happen in 2020?
Well, so my crystal ball, if all these plans are on the table at General Conference 2020, I think currently the only one that has a shot at passing is the U.S.'s Regional Conference. And I think that's true because it's the only one that has support of the global church. Timeline for the top one is tricky because it gives the U.S. the authority to adapt the Book of Discipline, but it has to be it's a constitutional change. And so that means it takes at least 18 months for people to vote on it. And so the earliest we could implement is 2022 or 2023. And so that's the downside of the top one, is that it's going to take some time to get there. That's the earliest. And there's two parts to it. I didn't go into this, but there's a part that, let's say the constitutional part doesn't pass. There's a part that would give us some flexibility in the meantime, but that we couldn't do until 2024. So this is a long timeline. These things would happen immediately, but I don't know that they have enough votes to pass. So that's something I don't know. Yeah, and
I'm gonna go back to a really earlier slide.
Yeah.
Where it said that a bishop cannot ordain a person that is confessed of being,
A self-avowed practicing homosexual.
yes.
Yes.
Is there any way that will ever change?
So the legislation that the UMC Next group and the Forward group, there's another set of petitions out of the West, and part of their proposal is also just to undo all of these things that we just passed in 2019. So at any time you can revise any part of the discipline every 4 years. And so part of the proposal is just to say, okay, we added this, let's cut it out. We added this, let's cut it out. We added it, let's cut it out. So those things are on the table. I don't know if they'll pass or not. That's a question.
Well, it seems like we're cutting out a big chunk of good people from doing ministry
We are limiting our pool.
by doing that.
So,
There's an active case in the Iowa City area right now.
Yes.
Can you address that?
I will. So my colleague Anna Bladel had been charged with being a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which they fully admit to me. So there was, I don't know that there was ever an attempt to reach a just resolution in that. The complaint came 18 months ago. And I think our bishop was waiting to see what happened in February 2019. Kind of thinking that if we change the rules, it all might be mute, so let's not worry about it. Since then, the complaint against Anna went through the process. So didn't seek a just resolution. It went to the Committee on Investigation, and they said there's enough evidence for a trial. And so there apparently was a date scheduled for a trial, but it was not announced. But Anna and counsel for the church, which is basically like the lawyer for the church, and the bishop, they did reach a resolution. And so there will not be a trial. And the resolution that they released, I found really interesting. Anna is on voluntary leave. Anna's been on voluntary leave to attend school. So Anna remains on voluntary leave until Anna chooses to come off of voluntary leave. And the resolution says the person who brought the complaint could not name any ways that they were harmed, and the church cannot name any ways that we were harmed, but Anna has been harmed by this process. It's basically what the resolution says. And so that's where it's done, it's signed, so that's where that particular process is. Yeah.
Is there any talk about removing the statement that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian faith? Is that a part of, at what point? I find that very offensive.
Yeah, so I would say I talked about the structural pieces, but at the same time, you've got folks on both ends of the spectrum who have proposals for changing this. Some would make it stricter. Some would say, let's take all that stuff out. And some in the middle would say, if we just take it all out and not include anything affirmative, that may create space. So if we just said nothing about same-sex marriage whatsoever, that might create enough space for some more conservative folks and some more progressive folks to stay in the same church together. And so there's a lot of proposals to do that, to take out the language that's controversial, but not to say anything affirmative. And I think the folks who are in the progressive non-compatibilist group would say, I can't stay in a church unless you include affirmative language in all those places. So that's also kind of a tension right now. That's a good question. Dave, you have a question?
Well, is it possible that we can get to a point where, say, a church in Des Moines is one that would allow gay marriages and a gay pastor, and another church would not, and still stay in the same conference?
Yeah.
And then it's terrible, but if somebody wanted to be married, they go to the other church.
So I think something like taking out the language would create that possibility. So, well, it would basically be that the general church isn't setting a rule about that, but local churches could. So that's basically what that would come down to. One of the proposals in 2019 was actually, that was what it created, was proposing. The one church plan is that each group, each church would decide where they wanted to be, but we all stay in the Methodist church. But that didn't pass. So that was kind of and have we changed enough votes so that that could pass? I don't know. That's the
Has
kind of
Grace
question.
Church come out? Has Grace Church come out and said that they will promote?
Yeah. So there are churches in Iowa and Des Moines that have said this is who we're going to be, and so Walnut Hills United Methodist Church, Grace United Methodist Church, First United Methodist Church, Indianola First United Methodist Church. They're all part of an organization called the Reconciling Ministries Network. So they have said, we will do weddings in our church. And if we have gay clergy appointed, we will fully support them. You've also got churches, I talked about those different groups that kind of align with different areas. You've also got churches that are aligning with the Wesley Covenant Association and saying, this is who we are. And so we're going to be upfront, and we've already had the conversation as a church. And so this is who we are, and this is the direction we're going to go when all of this shakes out. So you've got folks kind of on both ends who have had that conversation.
So how did the church like Walnut Hills, how did we come to that conclusion in that church that they could vote?
Yeah, so how do you get to that process? So for either of those options, it starts with folks having conversations, saying, this is a change we want to make. Indianola is probably the most recent one to do that, so I'm aware a little bit of what the process that they had was. So there was a task group that they formed to look at the possibilities, and then they had church-wide conversations about it before they ever brought it to church council for a vote. So it was probably they started in March, and they voted in August. So it took a little bit of time. They went through it pretty fast, I have to admit. Some churches have taken a year or two to go through that process. So that's a good question. Technically, it's supposed to be the whole church. It's supposed to be a charge conference. I think the statement they adopted was only voted on by their ad council.
Any church can do whatever they want to do, as long as someone doesn't bring a complaint. Because those churches are going against what the discipline says.
Right, those churches are going against what the discipline says. There is not a process to bring a complaint against a church. It doesn't exist. Like in the local church category, there is no judicial process related to churches. You can only bring a complaint against an individual. Yes.
Okay, so if we would vote to entertain homosexual marriage, would you do the service?
But I would be happy to.
But then you could get in big trouble.
I could get in big trouble. But personally, I feel like it's an unjust rule, and so I'm happy to break it. I personally also feel like the decision a church makes needs to be a church decision, because I'm, as your pastor, I'm appointed here. So someone different could be appointed here in 6 months. And so whatever decision you want to make has to be the decision you want to live with. And so my personal stance is also that I will respect the decision that this church is making. And so if this church also voted on the opposite end, to not allow same-sex weddings, I would not do a same-sex wedding.
So what if a same-sex couple came to you and went for
Yeah.
a wedding?
Mhm.
Or if we as a church did?
So I would respect the decision of the church, which technically by not making a decision, we have a default decision. So,
I'm glad to hear that you would be happy to disagree, you would go against some of those rules. I feel the same way about tax rules. I feel that unjust.
so part of it for me is also that I am working, I'm part of a process to change a rule that I think is unjust. I also then, this is a congregation needs to have a conversation, but I'm also, all clergy are having that internal conversation about if the church goes any of these directions, where will we go? Which is different from where a local church would go. So it's also kind of like a personal discernment in the midst of all these conversations. So, yes.
So there was a time where we're basically segregated. Are there parallels here, and what was the process that happened to desegregate the Methodist Church? And was there the possibility of splitting up then? I know the dynamics are different and so on, but maybe compare and contrast a little bit.
That's a really great question. So the Methodist Church, when we came back together in the 30s, created a central conference, and the Black Church, the Black UMC Church, the Black Methodist Church was in the central conference. When the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church merged to create the United Methodist Church, the EUB Church refused to join as long as there was a central conference. And so it's directly a result of the EUB Church that we did away with that. And that wasn't until 1968. 1968. So there was 30 to 40 years of that time. So it was kind of this leverage point. It was kind of a decision point anyway. So there were a lot of changes happening. And so the EUB Church said, we will not be a part of continuing the segregation, so we will only come and join if you do it with that structure. So that was really what kind of catapulted that change. So it could, I actually think thinking about that history is really helpful, because even if I think about the potential for a split, let's say we do split. We also have a history of getting back together again. Everybody split apart for a while. We currently today have good relationships with the AME Church, with the CME Church, and the AME Zion Church. I don't think those churches ever want to become United Methodists. We're happy to all play together as like sisters, but not like cousins maybe, but not part of the exact same nuclear family. I kind of see that potential is happening, that I think we'll have groups on either end who will split apart and say, we can't be a part of this anymore. And I hope they will thrive. Whatever groups leave, I hope they'll thrive. If we have a gigantic split down the middle, I hope someday we can get back together. I think it's more likely that it'll take a long time. That took a long time.
You have that one chart that had 4 things at the top, and you said, oh, this is going to take a long time.
Yeah.
And I looked at that and I thought, well, maybe that's a good thing. We have more meetings and other rule changes. The situation could rather remain in flux a little bit.
Yeah.
And go longer time frame, but actually looking
Could be helpful.
in a good favor.
I think that could be true. I think the downside is that there are a lot of folks in the United States who are really upset right now on both ends of the theological spectrum. And I think if I came back at the end of May and said, there will be changes, but we don't know exactly what those changes will be because we won't get to vote until 2023. I think a whole lot of people will say, I can't wait that long. I'm out of here. So I think that's the downside of the top one. Just logistically. The other thing, the other ones happen faster, but so I talked about structure. The thing I didn't talk about necessarily is, so let's say you look at the second option, which the church splits in two. The more progressive church, whatever you want to call it, keeps the boards and agencies. But half the church goes traditional, half the denomination. Can the more progressive church even sustain that structure if half of their funding is gone? So that's a question. And then you also have things like, how do you divide up? The proposal is to divide the assets based on the membership of the churches. But how do you divide up something like the Indiana health system is owned by the United Methodist Church. So, like, we used to own Methodist Hospital, but we don't anymore. But the Indiana health system is still owned by the United Methodist Church. So how do you divide that up? That I have no idea how you would begin, or like Simpson College, how do you start dividing up some of those assets? My biggest fear is that we will vote to make, well, okay, I actually think maybe not voting anything would be the worst thing that could possibly happen. Maybe the second worst would be to vote one of those options to divide the church and then get caught in something like Brexit. You can vote to make a change and logistically have no way of accomplishing it. And that, I think, could also be a reality we face.
If nothing happens, you face some people giving up. And now all of a sudden you've got this huge facility to finance, you've got staff to finance, you've got all these things to finance, and a lot fewer people to finance. So doing nothing, I think, is also ultimately going to be a disaster.
But there are a lot of churches, though, that are so small that maybe this would lead to combining of some of the church and, making more economical for us to continue. I mean, look at this neighborhood. There's a lot of small Methodist churches here.
You should learn that when you give Dave a mic, he asks a lot more questions when he has a mic.
One of the realities, I said we keep to an hour. We're just a little bit over. We can keep going if people want to stick around, but I want to kind of tie things up. I didn't create a slide about this, but something I talked about in finance tonight I think is also important. One of the things that's happening as a result is people are making decisions right now. So some churches have decided to leave. Some congregations have decided, I'm not going to pay a portion of this until I get my way. That goes on both sides of the theological spectrum, because some people are also unhappy that the rules we passed are not being enforced. So that happens both sides. And so in Iowa, we are currently facing some financial difficulties as a result of that, because Iowa, like I said, is kind of all across the board. So our Iowa, we have our budget for apportionments, but we request for apportionments each year. Normally we get like 78 to 80% of that amount is what's actually turned in. Not every church can make it. They kind of budget for that by allocating a little bit more to everybody. That kind of create a cushion. Currently, they're expecting our Iowa annual conference budgets to only be paid, apportionments to only be paid at 65%. And so what that means is they, this year, cut $1.5 million from the budget. And they're looking in, I've seen proposals. They haven't actually submitted they don't have to submit it till January, February. But I've heard them talking about moving from a $14 million budget to a $6 or $8 million budget in 1 year. And so this year, to cut the funds we've already cut, they moved from 8 district offices to 4. And at the end of this year, they're closing all of those 4 district offices. So in Iowa, we're making some really tough decisions because that finance isn't there. We cut all of our funding, almost all of our funding for our Wesley Foundations and campus ministry. We're looking at cutting funds for camp. We're looking at, there's less funds for well, there's just not the money to allocate to these things. So in Iowa, we're feeling the financial impact of this conflict. So, yeah. And that's not just Iowa, that's in general. I serve on global ministries, and global ministries are generally well respected, especially UMCOR. Like, everyone talks about, we don't like what's happening in the church except for UMCOR. Like, everyone says, yay, UMCOR. Our giving to UMCOR was down 25% this year in April, which is significant. Yeah. And that's money that goes directly to disaster. It's not used for overhead or anything. So, what is next? Okay. What is next is all of these different proposals and plans. We will get the legislation packets in January or February, and those who are elected as delegates will have time to look through them and make decisions and think about them. May 5th through the 15th is the next general conference, so we will be in Minneapolis in May, and all of that stuff will be up for vote. I have no idea what will happen in May. In June, our Iowa annual conference will meet, and so depending on what happens, Iowa may have decisions to make or not. And then the other thing that happens is in July, the North Central jurisdiction meets. All the jurisdictions meet in the summer. And what we will do at our jurisdictional conference is we will vote to elect new bishops. It's the primary thing we do at jurisdictional conference. And so that will definitely happen. I think we're electing, it'll be 1 or 2, depending on the population. We may only get 1. And so we will elect bishops. I also think jurisdictions are looking at some creative things they might do in response to what happens at General Conference. The Western jurisdiction has together made plans for doing something completely different. And that may be that they leave, no matter what happens. It may be that they say, we're going to stay, but we're going to do whatever we want. And there's no enforcement policy, just like there's no enforcement for a church. There's no enforcement for a jurisdiction. So they may say, we're going to stay and we're just going to do whatever we want. That's kind of part of their proposal, to be completely honest. Their proposal is safe harbor, so they're kind of saying we're going to be safe. Oh, thanks.
Thank you.